You didn't stay because you were weak, you stayed because their emptiness felt familiar. Some wounds don't scream. They seduce, they sound like home, and when love has always meant abandoning yourself, you won't see the danger until you disappear. You didn't choose them. Something deeper did. Something quiet and buried. Something older than memory. You met them, and it felt like a beginning, but it was a return. The way their words hooked into your nervous system, the way their eyes scanned you like they already knew what part of you to echo, what wound to mirror. This wasn't coincidence. This was choreography, written long before either of you arrived. People think love is a conscious act, a decision, but this was a psychic contract. Invisible, ancestral, maybe even archetypal. The empath doesn't fall in love with the narcissist. They answer a summons, and that call is not romantic. It is gravitational, irrational, terrifying. It does not speak in language. It hums in the bones, a familiarity that defies logic. They touch your loneliness like it's home. They speak to the part of you that was never allowed to speak, and, for a moment, you feel seen, not for who you are, but for the emptiness they reflect. And you mistake that reflection for recognition. You call it connection, but it's a pact, an old unconscious agreement, forged in the unmet needs of your childhood. Maybe you learned early that love means sacrifice, that being chosen means being useful, that attention must be earned, and pain endured in silence. So when they show up, grand, charming, hungry, but fractured, you don't run. You feel responsible, you feel needed, and something in you whispers, I can fix this, I can fix them, I can finally make love safe. But that voice is not your higher self. It is your wounded child trying to rewrite the ending, and so the story begins again, not as romance, but as reenactment. The narcissist does not see you. They sense you. They sense the light you haven't claimed and the boundaries you haven't drawn. And without knowing why, you open, not just your heart, but your soul, your energy, your body. You begin to bend, to give, to explain, to forgive things too early, to overlook things too big. And with each silent compromise, a part of you disappears. Not all at once, but in whispers, and you don't even notice. Because the contract has been activated, not signed in ink, but in pain. In the echo of what you once needed and never got. The narcissist didn't cause the original wound. They just reminded you where it was, and now they live in it, rent-free, feeding on your light. And you keep handing it over, because part of you still believes that if you give enough, love will finally stay. But this is not love. It is a performance, a transaction, an old myth trying to become true, and in trying to heal them, you abandon yourself again. There is a reason the empath doesn't run, a reason they feel called instead of cautioned, and it has nothing to do with logic. The empath is not simply kind. They are encoded with an ancient pattern, a myth older than language. They carry the energy of the wounded healer, the Chiron archetype, the medicine soul who was once cut open so deeply that they now sense the ache in others like a second skin. This isn't sentimentality. It isn't weakness. It's psychic attunement. And it comes with a cost, because when you are shaped by pain, you develop radar for the wounded. And the narcissist is nothing if not a wound wrapped in armor. They arrive not as monsters but as mirrors. They are not whole but hollow. And they don't show you that hollowness directly. They hide it beneath charm, projection, performance. They seduce not by presence but by echo. And the empath to feel before they think senses the cry behind the confidence, the starvation behind the smile, and they reach, not out of desire, but out of recognition. The narcissist does not reflect who the empath is. They reflect who the empath once was, or who they fear they still might be. Unloved, unseen, unprotected. This is not love. This is archetypal gravity. The meeting of two opposites distorted by imbalance. The empath feels too much. The narcissist feels too little. And together they form a loop, not of healing, but of projection. The empath projects goodness, sacrifice, hope. The narcissist projects blame, entitlement, emptiness, and in that loop, neither sees the other, only the wound within, and the wound speaks louder than the soul. This is why the empath stays. They don't see the narcissist clearly. They see the broken child behind the facade. They see the unmet need, and they think, if I love them well enough, if I stay soft, if I stay patient, maybe they'll finally feel safe enough to open. But the narcissist is not built to open. They are built to protect what was never validated. And that protection becomes performance, and that performance becomes identity. They are not healing, they are surviving, and anything that threatens the mask feels like danger. So the more the empath offers vulnerability, the more the narcissist retreats or attacks, not because they don't feel, but because feeling would collapse the persona they depend on to exist. The empath doesn't understand this at first, because their pain made them open, made them receptive, made them ache for connection, but the narcissist's pain made them closed, made them defended, made them hungry for control, and so the empath gives more, and the narcissist takes more, and the wound deepens on both sides. The empath becomes drained, confused, ashamed for needing anything at all. They begin to believe that loving harder will fix what distance has made worse. But this is not a flaw in character. It's the echo of an old identity. The empath learned to survive by being good, by being needed, by being silent, and now, when the narcissist mirrors back rejection, it confirms a fear already living in the empath's nervous system. That love will always mean losing the self, that being chosen always requires bleeding first, and so they stay, not because they don't know the truth, but because they once made a promise to themselves that they would be the one who never abandoned the ones who hurt. But they never realized that in keeping that promise, they would abandon themselves. It was never love that pulled you in. It was recognition, not of their soul, but of your wound. They didn't see you, they reflected you. Not the version of you that had healed, but the version still aching to be enough, still starving to feel seen. The narcissist is not a mirror of wholeness. They are a mirror of absence. A surface that doesn't show who you are, but who you fear you might still be. Empty, needy, unseen. And when you stood before them, something cracked open. Not because they loved you, but because they mirrored the part of you that was still waiting to be chosen. And in that reflection, you mistook performance for presence. You mistook familiarity for destiny. They echoed your deepest hunger and called it fate. But it was only a loop, a reenactment, the psyche remembering what the mind forgot. You see, the narcissist doesn't connect, they construct. They study you like a map, searching for the coordinates of your craving, your hope, your dream of finally being enough. And then they become it, not because they are it, but because you want it so badly you don't notice the shape is hollow. The mirror is flawless, but it has no depth. And yet you stare into it like it's salvation, because somewhere in your story, love became conditional. Visibility became transactional, and you learned to attach to those who withheld affection, like oxygen, rationed by performance, and now you find yourself here again, staring at someone who never truly sees you, hoping this time, if you shine bright enough, if you love hard enough, the mirror will finally hold something back. But it doesn't. It distorts, it absorbs, it manipulates, not with cruelty, but with emptiness. They don't hurt you by intention, they hurt you by absence. They don't injure you with words, they injure you with the silence where connection should have been, and you begin to disappear, piece by piece, not from abuse, but from echo. You forget what your voice sounds like when it's not apologizing. You forget how to sit in your own presence without performing, and the tragedy is, you still believe this is love. But what you're loving is not them. It's the hope that finally, this time, you'll be enough to keep someone close, not by chasing, but by simply existing. But the narcissist cannot hold that kind of love, because they haven't given it. To themselves, they do not know how to receive, only how to reflect, and when your light begins to flicker, when your soul starts to rebel against the self-erasure, they won't reach for you, they'll blame you, and the mirror that once flattered you now shames you. And still, you stay, because the part of you that's still unfinished sees them not as the danger, but as the missing piece. And this is how the loop continues, not with chains, but with longing. This was never love, but it dressed like it, it smiled like it, it whispered promises in the dark like it, but underneath, it was a reenactment. An echo of something earlier, older, deeper, a pattern you didn't choose but kept repeating, not because you wanted pain, but because pain was once how you learned to feel connected. This is the essence of trauma bonding. It doesn't shout, it seduces, it convinces you that chaos is chemistry, that anxiety is passion, that the ache in your chest means something real is happening, because once upon a time, you were conditioned to believe that affection came with conditions, that love had to be earned through endurance, that being needed was safer than being seen. So now, when someone triggers your fear of abandonment and follows it with a moment of warmth, your nervous system calls it love, not because it is, but because it's familiar. and the body always returns to what feels like home, even if that home once hurt you. This is why the narcissist's cycle of idealization and devaluation feels so powerful. The high is only so intoxicating because the low was so devastating, and your mind becomes addicted, not to the person, but to the pattern, to the hit of being valued again after being discarded, to the hope that this time, maybe, you'll be enough to break the cycle. But the cycle was never yours to fix. The narcissist doesn't love in the way you hope. They attach for utility, for energy, for validation. And when they sense that you're hooked, they loosen their grip, not to leave, but to maintain control. They know just how to withhold, just how to apologize without changing, just how to say what you ache to hear without ever meaning it, and you stay, because deep inside, there's a younger version of you still trying to prove they're worth staying for. So you try harder, give more, tolerate longer, not realizing that the longer you stay, the more you lose yourself. And the tragedy is, you confuse this collapse with commitment. You call your silence maturity, you call your pain love, and in doing so, you keep abandoning the very self you claim to protect. But trauma bonding is not devotion, it's repetition. It's the psyche reenacting its earliest wounds in hopes of a different ending. And the narcissist is not your partner in healing. They are the mirror of the unfinished, the symbol of what you haven't yet reconciled. They bring the ache to the surface not to resolve it, but to keep it alive, because their power depends on your confusion, and your confusion keeps you loyal, not to them, but to the illusion that this pain will somehow lead to peace. But it won't, not because you're unworthy, but because the story is broken. The script was written without your consent, and the only way to escape it is not by fixing the character in front of you, but by stepping off the stage entirely. There comes a moment when your body knows before your mind does, when your nervous system begins to whisper what your words still refuse to speak. Something is wrong, something is off, but you can't name it, because you've been conditioned to doubt your discomfort, to explain away the ache, to romanticize your own erasure. So you keep smiling, keep giving, keep shrinking in the name of love. But inside, the descent has already begun. Not a fall, but a slow unraveling, a hollowing out of voice, of will, of clarity. You start forgetting what you like, what you want, what you need. You second-guess your tone, your timing, your truth. You feel everything too much and nothing at all. You're exhausted but can't sleep, anxious but can't move. And people still tell you how strong you are, how lucky you must be. But you're disappearing in plain sight, and no one sees it, because not even you can explain what's happening. You just know something inside is slipping, and that something is you. This is the descent. The collapse of the self beneath the weight of a role that was never yours to carry. The savior, the fixer, the endlessly understanding one. The more you show up for them, the less you recognize yourself, and the less they notice you at all. You become background, context, a source of supply, and you start to feel ashamed for wanting more, ashamed for needing rest, ashamed for wondering what happened to your joy. And the shame keeps you quiet, so you keep performing, keep managing their moods, their projections, their wounds, while yours fester in silence. And when your soul starts to protest, it speaks in symptoms: anxiety, brain fog, stomach pain, dissociation, overthinking, forgetting, overfunctioning. These are not flaws, they are flags. The soul doesn't scream, it signals, and right now, it is begging you to look, not at them, but at the part of you that believed you had to become someone else just to feel safe. You didn't lose yourself in this. You gave yourself away in pieces, slowly, believing that if you just stayed soft enough, patient enough, loyal enough, they would finally choose you. But what you failed to see is that the one who wasn't choosing you was you. You abandoned your own voice to protect theirs, and now, your silence has become a prison, and your empathy a leash. And the deeper you fall, the more you realize that this isn't heartbreak, it's self-forgetting, and the only way back is not through being loved harder, but through remembering who you were before you began to beg for worth. There is a part of you that didn't just love being needed, it depended on it, because somewhere along the line, being needed became your proof of worth, your safety, your identity, and so you stepped into the fire again and again, not just to help, but to matter, to exist, to feel essential. You weren't just giving love. You were trying to become irreplaceable, because being irreplaceable meant being kept, and being kept meant being safe. So you gave, not from abundance, but from fear. from the ache of not knowing who you are without the role of the savior, and the narcissist, whether they know it or not, feeds on that role. They pull you in with their chaos, with their hunger, with their wounds that never seem to close. And you think, if I just love them enough, if I stay long enough, if I carry enough, maybe they'll finally feel whole, and maybe then, they'll finally love me back the way I need. But what you don't see is that this is not healing. This is control disguised as compassion. It's the ego dressed as empathy. And the price is always yourself. The more you rescue, the more invisible you become. The more you bleed, the more they expect. And somewhere along the way, you start believing that your suffering makes you good, that your silence makes you strong, that your ability to endure is proof of your capacity to love. But it isn't. It's proof of how long you've been away from yourself, how deeply you've confused being devoured with being devoted. You became the savior because once you were the child, no one came to save. And now, without realizing it, you are trying to complete a story that was never fair to begin with. The story where love is earned by disappearing, where presence is traded for performance. And the deeper tragedy is this: the narcissist doesn't want to be saved, they want to be supplied, and the more you try to rescue them, the more they resent you for revealing their dependency, and the more you lose yourself trying, the more they lose respect, not because you are weak, but because in their mind, if you were truly valuable, you wouldn't need to beg to be seen. And this is the cruel irony of the savior complex. The more holy it feels, the more self-abandoning it becomes. You were never meant to bleed to be loved. You were never meant to be consumed to be chosen, but you keep showing up like a sacrifice, like you were born to absorb someone else's pain, when really, you were born to recognize your own, not as a curse, but as a compass. And until you do, you will keep calling this crucifixion love, and they will keep calling your light a resource, not a person, and the loop will continue, until one day, mercy enters, not as forgiveness for them, but as forgiveness for yourself. For every time you thought loving someone else meant leaving yourself behind, for every time you thought being good meant being silent, for every time you thought you had to be less in order to be held, and in that mercy, the savior dies, and the self begins to breathe again. At some point, the mirror stops flattering you. It stops reflecting who you wish you were, and starts revealing who you've become. And what you see is not beautiful, not whole, not alive. What you see is a version of yourself shaped entirely around their emptiness, contorted to keep the peace, silenced to avoid conflict, hypervigilant in the name of love, and something in you begins to break, not all at once, but like glass under pressure, a slow shatter, invisible from the outside, but deafening inside your chest. You start remembering how loud your laughter used to be, how soft your boundaries once were before they calcified into survival strategies, and for the first time, you realize that you weren't in love with them. You were in love with the illusion they held up in front of you, the fantasy that if you just gave enough, proved enough, stayed long enough, they would finally love you the way you never dared to ask for. But the mirror was never about them. It was always about the part of you that still believed your worth had to be earned, the part that confused validation with value, the part that mistook recognition for safety. And now, that mirror is cracking, and the fragments are sharp. They show you how often you abandoned yourself just to keep being chosen, how often you swallowed your voice so they wouldn't leave, how often you bent your truth to fit their denial, and the truth hits harder than their rejection ever did. Because now you see it wasn't just them keeping you small, it was you, clinging to a version of love that required your disappearance. And suddenly, everything you called connection begins to look like a contract. Everything you called love starts to feel like survival, and the grief rushes in. Not for them, but for the years you spent dimming your light in hopes it would make you easier to hold. But light was never your problem. It was never that you were too much. It was that they could never receive what you gave without distorting it, because they weren't reflecting your essence, they were reflecting your fear. And now with the mirror cracked, you begin to see yourself not as broken, but as buried, not as too sensitive, but as deeply attuned, not as hard to love, but as someone who forgot how to love themselves first. And this is where the awakening begins. Not with fire, not with clarity, but with mourning. Because when the mirror breaks, you don't just lose the illusion of them, you lose the illusion of who you thought you had to be in order to be loved. You don't leave in rage, you leave in silence, not because you don't care, but because something deeper finally does. And it's not about them anymore, it's about you, about the self that you buried under every apology, every compromise, every moment you stayed when your soul begged you to go. And now, with the mirror cracked and the illusion broken, you see it clearly. This was never about saving them. It was about remembering you. And so you rise. Not loudly, not dramatically, but gently, like someone waking up from a long dream they didn't know they were in. You don't scream, you don't explain, you don't wait for closure that never comes. You simply walk, not away from them, but toward yourself. And that walk, that quiet severing, is not cruelty. It is resurrection. It is the moment you choose to exist outside the story that was never written for your healing. And yes, it hurts. Not because you're wrong, but because for so long, you confused suffering with love, survival with loyalty. And now, every step you take away from that dynamic feels like betrayal. But it isn't. It's realignment. It's the soul correcting what fear distorted. And though the guilt may rise, though the echoes of their voice may follow, you keep walking, because you no longer belong to the version of you that believed love meant self-erasure. And they may not understand. They may call you heartless, cold, selfish, but they are speaking to the version of you that no longer exists. The one who stayed to be needed, the one who bled to be seen. And now, you don't need to be needed to feel worthy. You don't need to be understood to feel whole. Because worth is no longer a transaction. It's your birthright, and love is no longer a test, it's a reflection. And you are no longer performing, you are remembering. And this remembering is what undoes the spell. This is what heals the wound. Not their apology, not their change, but your refusal to keep betraying yourself. And that refusal, that quiet revolution, is how you rise. Not as a savior, not as a symbol, but as a self, sovereign, steady, and finally, free. When the loop finally ends, it does not end with fire or fury. It ends with stillness. A quiet clarity that no longer needs explanation, no longer needs to be right, to be understood, to be redeemed. You do not walk away to teach a lesson. You walk away because you no longer need to learn the same one again. And in that choice, the self returns. Not as a version, not as a role, but as the whole. You stop looking in others for the reflection of your worth. You stop offering your light as proof that you deserve to stay. You stop shrinking into shapes just to be less threatening, less much, less real. And what rises is not a louder voice, but a steadier presence, not a sharper edge, but a softer truth. You no longer need to be needed, no longer fear being alone, because the part of you that once begged for love has finally been met by you. And this is what ends the cycle. Not vengeance, not distance, but sovereignty. A rootedness in self so complete that manipulation cannot enter, projection cannot stick, and old patterns dissolve without resistance. Not because they were defeated, but because they are no longer necessary. You are no longer an orbit around anyone else's hunger. You are no longer a mirror for someone else's shadow. You are no longer a refuge for someone who refuses to come home to themselves. And yes, they may return, they may test the door, cloaked in new language, bearing spiritual rhetoric or familiar charm, but the door no longer opens. Not because you're cruel, but because you no longer live there. You have crossed the threshold. And what stands on the other side is not applause, not validation, but peace. Not performance, but essence. Not identity, but presence. And you realize you were never too sensitive, too intense, too emotional. You were simply placed in stories too small for the soul you came here to embody. And now, as you rise, not loudly, not triumphantly, but truthfully, you carry no bitterness, no armor, no need to prove. Only this quiet knowing that love is not something you chase, it is something you become. And the moment you stopped chasing, you became free. Not because they changed, but because you did. Not because the wound closed on its own, but because you finally stopped bleeding. For someone else's healing, the mirror shattered, the pattern ended, and in its place stands you, not as a savior, not as a survivor, but as a sovereign soul, whole, unhooked, and home.